The rain had not ceased for 3 days, and the damp had crept into every corner of Lindale Manor until Eulalia felt it in her very bones. She stood at the window of the small sitting room, watching the water stream down the glass in rivulets that distorted the already bleak view of the gardens. The last of the autumn roses had surrendered to the assault, their petals lying sodden and brown against the muddy earth, and the ancient oak at the edge of the lawn had lost more than half its leaves in the gale that had howled through the night before. Eulalia pressed her palm against the cold glass and allowed herself precisely one moment of self-pity. She was 25, which the county had long since declared too old for any reasonable expectation of marriage. She kept her father's threadbare manor with a steady hand, knew the true price of coal and exactly how long the mutton could be made to last, and had learned over the years to keep her sharp tongue behind her teeth, because a poor gentlewoman with opinions is a luxury no household can afford. She heard her father's footsteps in the corridor, the familiar shuffle that had grown more pronounced in recent years, and she turned from the window with a practiced smile. "Papa, you should not be out of your chair. The draught in the hallway is dreadful." Sir Reginald Lindale was a man of 63 years, though he looked nearer 70, with thinning white hair and a face lined by grief and the endless struggle to maintain appearances on an income that grew smaller with each passing season. He smiled at his daughter, that gentle, apologetic smile that had always broken her heart just a little, and offered her the letter he carried. "A reply from the Duke of Ravensworth, my dear. It seems he will indeed be joining us for dinner this evening." Eulalia took the letter with hands that remained perfectly steady, though something cold and unpleasant settled in her stomach. The Duke of Ravensworth was a figure of some notoriety in the county, a man who had inherited his title and considerable fortune 5 years prior, following the tragic death of his father and elder brother in a carriage accident. He had retreated to his vast estate, Ravensworth Castle, and had rarely been seen in society since. The stories that circulated about him were not kind. He was said to be cold, arrogant, and utterly indifferent to the sensibilities of those beneath his station. But more than the unpleasant rumors, what troubled Eulalia was the suddenness of this visit. The Duke had never shown the slightest interest in her father's affairs before, and she suspected, with a sinking feeling, that there was more to this invitation than simple neighborly courtesy. "Papa, why is the Duke coming to dinner? We have not had such an illustrious visitor in." "Never mind that, my dear. The important thing is that he is coming, and we must make a proper impression." Sir Reginald's voice held a note of desperate hope that Eulalia had not heard in years. "If I can secure his support for the land drainage project, perhaps I can." "Papa, we cannot afford to entertain a duke. The best mutton alone would cost." "The Duke will not care about the cost, Eulalia. He is a man of great wealth and influence. If I can just speak with him, make him understand the importance of the project to the local farmers, perhaps he will." Eulalia wanted to point out that the Duke's interest in the drainage project was likely non-existent, that a man of his station would have no concern for the flooding that plagued the valley farms every spring. But she looked at her father's hopeful face, and she could not bring herself to shatter his illusion. "Very well, Papa. I will see to the arrangements." The hours that followed were a blur of frantic activity. The cook, Mrs. Higgins, was dispatched to the village with a list of provisions that made her eyes widen in alarm. The housemaid, a nervous girl of 16 named Polly, was set to polishing the silver that had not seen use since her mother's death. And Eulalia herself spent the better part of the afternoon in the kitchen, directing the preparation of dishes that her father's limited income could barely afford. By the time the Duke's carriage was sighted coming up the long drive, the house was transformed. The drawing-room fire blazed, the candles were lit, and the dinner table had been set with her mother's best china, the delicate blue and white pattern that had survived 30 years of careful use. Eulalia had changed into her best gown, a pale green silk that had been her mother's and had been altered to fit her. It was not fashionable, and the dye had faded in places, but it was the finest thing she owned, and she wore it with the dignity of a woman who had long since learned that clothes do not make the person. The Duke arrived at precisely the appointed hour, and Eulalia had her first glimpse of him as he stepped from the carriage. He was tall, that was the first thing she noticed, with broad shoulders that filled his dark greatcoat, and he moved with the easy grace of a man accustomed to command. His face was striking rather than handsome, all sharp angles and a strong jaw, and his eyes, when they met hers briefly across the courtyard, were a cold, piercing gray that seemed to see straight through her. She did not like him. She knew it almost immediately, with a certainty that surprised her. There was something about the way he looked at their modest home, at the cracked stonework and the patchy roof, with an expression that she could only describe as weary contempt, as if the very sight of their genteel poverty was an offense to his sensibilities. "Your Grace," her father said, bowing low. "We are honored by your presence." The Duke inclined his head, a gesture that was barely civil. "Sir Reginald. I trust one find you well." "Very well, Your Grace, very well indeed." "Please, come in out of the cold. Allow me to introduce my daughter, Eulalia." The Duke turned his cold gaze upon her, and Eulalia felt a flicker of defiance rise in her chest. She had spent 25 years learning to read people, to understand their moods and expectations, and this man was a puzzle she could not quite solve. He was not simply arrogant, she realized. He was bored. Utterly, completely, devastatingly bored with the entire proceedings. "Miss Lindale," he said, his voice flat. "Your Grace," she replied, her curtsy perfect. It was all he said to her for the next hour. The dinner was a strained affair. Her father, desperate to make a good impression, spoke at length about the drainage project, about the needs of the local farmers, about the potential benefits to the Duke's own estate. The Duke listened with an expression of polite disinterest, offering monosyllabic replies that seemed to discourage further conversation. Eulalia watched him, and the more she watched, the more her irritation grew. He sat at her father's table, eating food that had cost a week's wages, drinking wine that had been carefully saved for a special occasion, and he had not once smiled or shown the slightest appreciation for the efforts that had gone into entertaining him. "Your Grace," her father said, his voice taking on that anxious, hopeful tone that made Eulalia's heart ache, "I wonder if you might consider supporting the drainage project. It would mean so much to the local farmers, and I am certain that." The Duke set down his glass with a soft click that somehow sounded like a dismissal. "I have no interest in drainage projects, Sir Reginald. But Your Grace, if you would just consider." "I have considered it, and I have declined. Your project is admirable, I am certain, but it does not concern me." Her father's face fell, and Eulalia felt something inside her snap. She had borne much in her life. She had borne the death of her mother, the slow decline of her family's fortunes, the unkind whispers of the county gossips, and the endless, grinding struggle to make ends meet on an income that seemed to shrink with every passing year. She had learned to hold her tongue, to smile and nod when she wanted to scream, to be the dutiful daughter who never complained and never caused trouble. But she could not bear to watch her gentle father be made small by this arrogant, cold man. "I wonder, Your Grace," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "if you have ever considered that boredom is not a misfortune that happens to you, but a discourtesy you are doing to others?" The silence that followed was absolute. Her father stared at her with an expression of pure horror. The Duke slowly turned his head to look at her, his gray eyes narrowing. "I beg your pardon." Eulalia met his gaze steadily. She was terrified, of course. He could ruin them with a word, could destroy what little they had left with a single stroke. But the words were out now, and she had never been one to retreat. "You are bored, Your Grace. It is written on your face, in every gesture you make. But I wonder if you understand that your boredom is not merely your own burden to bear. You have come to our home, eaten our food, drank our wine, and you have repaid every effort at hospitality with weary disdain. You have made my father small at his own table, and I suspect that no one has ever told you that this is not acceptable." The Duke's expression did not change, but something shifted in his eyes. A flicker of something that might have been surprise, or perhaps interest. "You are remarkably direct, Miss Lindale. I am tired, Your Grace. Tired of pretending that your indifference is anything other than rudeness. Tired of watching good people grovel for your approval when you have never shown yourself worthy of it." Eulalia's heart was pounding, her hands trembling beneath the table, but she kept her voice steady. She had spent 25 years being careful, being quiet, being the dutiful daughter who never caused trouble. If this was to be her ruin, she would at least go down fighting. "I do not expect you to support my father's project," she continued. "That is your right, and I have no doubt you have your reasons. But I do expect you to show common courtesy to a man who has opened his home to you and who has treated you with nothing but respect. Is that truly so much to ask?" The Duke was silent for a long moment. Then, to Eulalia's astonishment, the corner of his mouth twitched upward. It was not quite a smile, but it was something close. "You are quite right, Miss Lindale. I have been discourteous, and I apologize." He turned to her father, who was still pale with shock. "Sir Reginald, I must apologize for my behavior. I have been a poor guest, and I hope you will forgive me." Her father stammered something about no need to apologize, but the Duke silenced him with a gesture. "I will consider your proposal, Sir Reginald. I cannot promise to support it, but I will give it serious thought. And I will endeavor to be a better guest for the remainder of the evening." Eulalia stared at him, utterly confused. This was not the reaction she had expected. She had expected anger, dismissal, perhaps even outright fury. She had not expected the Duke of Ravensworth to apologize. The rest of the dinner passed in a blur. Her father, recovering from his shock, launched into a new series of observations about the drainage project, and the Duke listened with what appeared to be genuine attention. He asked questions, thoughtful ones, and by the time the meal ended, her father was beaming with the satisfaction of a man who had finally been heard. When the Duke took his leave, he paused at the door and turned back to look at Eulalia. "Miss Lindale," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear, "you have given me something to think about. I am not certain whether to thank you or to resent you for it." She met his gaze steadily. "I do not require your thanks or your resentment, Your Grace. I require only that you treat others with the kindness you would wish for yourself." The Duke studied her for a moment, and there was something unreadable in his eyes. Then he nodded, once, and stepped out into the rain. The story of the Duke's humiliation at the hands of a country spinster spread through the county like wildfire. Within a week, Eulalia could not walk into the village without hearing whispers, could not attend church without feeling the weight of curious stares upon her back. She had become something of a legend, the woman who had spoken truth to power, and she was not entirely certain how she felt about it. She saw the Duke twice more in the weeks that followed. Once at the market, where he was purchasing supplies for his estate, and once when his carriage passed hers on the road. On both occasions, he acknowledged her with a polite nod that was more than he had ever offered before, but he did not stop to speak, and Eulalia found herself relieved. "You have made an enemy, my dear," her father said one evening, his face troubled. "The Duke is a powerful man. He could ruin us if he wished. He has not ruined us yet, Papa." "No, but he may be waiting for the right moment." Sir Reginald shook his head. "I should never have allowed you to speak to him so freely. It was my fault, should have. You did nothing wrong, Papa." I spoke my mind, and if the Duke chooses to punish us for it, then he is not the man I took him for." Her father looked at her with a mixture of pride and worry. "You are very brave, Eulalia. But bravery does not always protect us from the consequences of our actions." Eulalia had no answer for that. She only knew that she could not have done otherwise, and that some things were worth fighting for, even if the fight was lost. 3 weeks after the dinner, a letter arrived at Lindale Manor. It was addressed to Eulalia, which was unusual enough, and the seal on the envelope bore the crest of the Duke of Ravensworth. Eulalia stared at the letter for a long moment, her heart pounding. She had no idea what the Duke could possibly want with her, but she suspected it was nothing good. Perhaps he had finally decided to punish her for her impertinence. Perhaps he was going to demand an apology, or worse, challenge her to a duel. She opened the letter with trembling fingers and read its contents. "My dear Miss Lindale, I have given considerable thought to our conversation at your father's dinner table, and I find myself unable to forget it. You have an uncommon talent for speaking truth, and I find I have need of someone who can be honest with me. I am to host a gathering at Ravensworth Castle next week, a dinner party for some of the most influential people in the county. I would be honored if you would attend as my guest. I know this is an unusual request, and I understand if you decline. But I would be grateful for your company. Yours sincerely, Ravensworth." Eulalia read the letter 3 times, trying to make sense of it. The Duke wanted her to attend a dinner party? The Duke, who had barely spoken a word to her before she had humiliated him at her father's table, now wanted her company? It made no sense. "What does the Duke want?" her father asked, peering at the letter over her shoulder. "He wants me to attend a dinner party at Ravensworth Castle." Sir Reginald's eyebrows shot up. "A dinner party? That is unexpected. Unexpected is one word for it. Are you going to accept?" Eulalia looked at the letter again, at the elegant handwriting and the formal phrasing. There was something about it that she could not quite identify, a note of desperation beneath the careful courtesy. "I think I have to, Papa. If only to find out what he wants." The journey to Ravensworth Castle took 2 hours by carriage, through winding country roads that grew increasingly grand as they approached the Duke's estate. Ravensworth was everything Eulalia had imagined and more, a vast, imposing structure of grey stone that rose against the sky like a fortress, its towers and turrets casting long shadows across the manicured grounds. The Duke received her in the great hall, a cavernous space with vaulted ceilings and walls adorned with tapestries that depicted scenes of battle and triumph. He was standing by the fire, and he turned as she entered, his expression carefully neutral. "Miss Lindale. Thank you for coming. Your Grace." She curtsied, more out of habit than deference. "Your invitation was unexpected." "I imagine it was." The Duke gestured to a chair near the fire. "Please, sit down. We have much to discuss." Eulalia sat, her heart racing. She had no idea what to expect, but she was determined to face it with the same courage she had shown at her father's dinner table. "I must apologize," the Duke began, "for the manner of my invitation. I know it is unorthodox, but I find myself in need of your help." "My help?" Eulalia could not keep the surprise from her voice. "What could I possibly offer that you do not already have?" The Duke smiled, a wry, self-deprecating expression that transformed his cold features. "Honesty. That is what you offered me at your father's table, and it is what I have been lacking for far too long." He walked to the window and stared out at the rain-soaked gardens. "My life, Miss Lindale, is a constant exercise in deception. People tell me what they think I want to hear, not what they truly believe. They flatter me, they court my favor, they smile at my jokes even when they find them tedious. I have not heard an honest word spoken to me in years. Until I spoke my mind at dinner, Eulalia said slowly. Until you spoke your mind at dinner. And I realized, in that moment, how much I had missed the simple truth. Eulalia was silent, trying to process this revelation. The Duke of Ravensworth, a man who could have anything he wanted, was lonely. And he had invited her here not to punish her, but because she had told him the truth. What exactly do you want from me, Your Grace? I want you to be my guest at the dinner party. I want you to tell me the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it may be. And I want you to help me see what others are too afraid to show me. Eulalia considered this. It was an odd request, to be certain, but there was something about the Duke's earnestness that moved her. He was not the cold, arrogant man she had taken him for. He was a man who had been isolated by his wealth and title, who had forgotten what it felt like to be treated as an ordinary person. I will help you, Your Grace, she said finally. But on one condition. Name it. You must treat me as an equal. Not as a servant to be commanded, not as a dependent to be patronized, but as a person worthy of your respect. If you cannot do that, then I cannot help you. The Duke studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes unreadable. Then he nodded. Agreed. From now on, you will be my equal in all things. It was a promise that would change both of their lives forever. The dinner party was an elaborate affair, attended by the most influential people in the county, Lord Ashworth and his wife, Lady Margaret, Sir Henry Blythe and his daughter, Amelia, the Dowager Countess of Westbrook, and a dozen others who Eulalia had only ever seen from a distance. She had been seated at the Duke's right hand, a position of honor that had drawn more than a few curious glances. She wore her mother's green silk gown again, the only fine dress she owned, and she had done her best with her hair, pinning it up in a simple but elegant style. Throughout the evening, the Duke was attentive and charming, a man transformed from the cold, bored figure she had met weeks earlier. He laughed at her jokes, listened to her opinions, and made her feel as though she were the only person in the room. The other guests were less welcoming. Lady Margaret, a formidable woman with a sharp tongue and a sharper eye, had fixed Eulalia with a stare that could have stripped paint. Miss Lindale, she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. How lovely of you to join us. I must say, you are not quite what I expected. Nor you, Lady Margaret, Eulalia replied, her smile fixed in place. I had heard you were charming. Lady Margaret's eyes narrowed. What a curious thing to say. Eulalia shrugged. I merely repeat what I have heard. The tension between them was palpable, but the Duke intervened with a smooth change of subject that left Lady Margaret fuming. Eulalia was grateful, but she also felt a small thrill of satisfaction. She had survived the first round. After dinner, the guests retired to the drawing room, but the Duke suggested a walk in the gardens. It was a clear night, the stars bright overhead, and the air was cool and refreshing after the heat of the dining room. They walked in silence for a moment, then the Duke spoke. You handled Lady Margaret well. She is not accustomed to being bested. I am not accustomed to being patronized, Eulalia replied. I suppose we are even. The Duke laughed, a low, genuine sound that surprised her. You are remarkable, Miss Lindale. Have I told you that? Not in so many words, Your Grace. Then allow me to remedy that. He stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious. You are remarkable. You are brave, honest, and utterly unafraid to speak your mind. I have never met anyone quite like you. Eulalia felt her cheeks warm. You flatter me, Your Grace. I do not flatter. I speak the truth, as you taught me to do. He reached out and took her hand, his fingers warm against her skin. I have a favor to ask you, Miss Lindale. A rather large favor. She looked at him, her heart pounding. What is it? Marry me. The words hung in the air between them, so unexpected that Eulalia could not quite process them. She stared at him, her mouth open, her mind racing. Marry you? But we barely know each other. We have only met a handful of times. I know, and I know how this must seem. But I have been thinking about it since the night we met. You challenged me, you saw through my defenses, and you made me feel something I had not felt in years. You made me feel alive. Eulalia shook her head. This is madness, Your Grace. I am not the sort of woman who marries a duke. You are precisely the sort of woman who marries a duke. A duke who needs someone to tell him the truth, to challenge him, to make him a better man. She wanted to say no. She knew it was the sensible thing to do. But she looked into his gray eyes, and she saw something there that she had not seen before. Vulnerability. Hope. A desperate need to be loved. I will consider it, she said finally. But I make no promises. The Duke smiled, a smile that transformed his cold features into something warm and open. That is all I ask. Eulalia's acceptance of the Duke's proposal did not go unnoticed. Lady Margaret, who had her own ambitions for the Duke, was furious. She saw Eulalia as a threat, an upstart who had no business being in the Duke's orbit, and she was determined to destroy her. You cannot possibly allow that woman to marry Ravensworth, Lady Margaret told the Duke at a gathering a week later. She is beneath you. Her family is penniless, her connections are non-existent, and she has the manners of a servant. The Duke's eyes hardened. You forget yourself, Lady Margaret. Miss Lindale is my guest, and she will be treated with respect. Respect? You expect me to respect a woman who has no breeding, no fortune, and no prospects? She is nothing but a fortune hunter. Enough. The Duke's voice was cold, cutting. I will not hear another word against Miss Lindale. She is the woman I intend to marry, and that is the end of the matter. Lady Margaret's face flushed with anger, but she held her tongue. She had been dismissed, and she knew it. But she would not give up so easily. She had resources, she had influence, and she had a network of allies who were equally determined to see the Duke make a more suitable match. She would find a way to destroy Eulalia Lindale, or die trying. Part 8, The Visitors. Eulalia received visitors in the following weeks, the Duke's cousins, his aunts, his sisters-in-law, all of them determined to assess the woman who had captured their family's most eligible bachelor. They ranged in temperament from the openly hostile to the coldly indifferent, and Eulalia found herself subjected to more scrutiny than she had ever experienced in her life. Miss Lindale, do you play the pianoforte? One of them asked, her tone implying that she already knew the answer. I do, Lady Beatrice. My mother taught me when I was a child. I see. And what of your father's estate? I understand it is rather modest. Modest, but well managed. My father is a good man who has been dealt some difficult circumstances. Lady Beatrice sniffed. I suppose that is one way of putting it. Eulalia felt her patience wearing thin, but she held her tongue. She would not be provoked, no matter how much they tried. But the real problem was not Lady Margaret or the Duke's relatives. The real problem was the Duke himself. As the wedding preparations continued, Eulalia began to see a different side of him. He was kind, of course, and attentive, but he was also deeply damaged. His father and brother had died in a carriage accident 5 years earlier, and he had never fully recovered from the loss. He was haunted by the memory, unable to forgive himself for the role he had played in the tragedy. I was supposed to be in the carriage with them, he confessed one night, his voice barely a whisper. But I was late, and they left without me. If I had been there, perhaps things would have been different. Eulalia reached out and took his hand. You cannot blame yourself for something that was not your fault. I know, but I cannot help it. He looked at her, his eyes wet with unshed tears. Every time I close my eyes, I see them. I hear the crash. I smell the smoke. Eulalia wrapped her arms around him, holding him close. She did not know what to say, but she knew that sometimes words were not necessary. Sometimes all a person needed was someone to hold them. Lady Margaret, not content to accept defeat, set her plan in motion. She had discovered, through her network of spies, that Eulalia's family had a secret, a shameful secret that could destroy her reputation forever. It was a letter, a love letter from her mother to another man, written long before she had married Sir Reginald. Lady Margaret had obtained the letter through a servant who had been in the Lindale household years ago, and she intended to use it to destroy Eulalia's reputation. You see, Your Grace, she said, showing the letter to the Duke at a private meeting, your precious Miss Lindale comes from a family of liars and cheats. Her mother was unfaithful to her father, and who knows what other secrets she is hiding. The Duke's face was impassive. You expect me to believe this? You expect me to believe that a woman of integrity, like Miss Lindale, would hide such a thing? I expect you to believe the evidence of your own eyes. This is a genuine letter, written by her own mother. You can see the handwriting, the signature. The Duke looked at the letter, his expression unreadable. Then he handed it back to Lady Margaret. Thank you for bringing this to my attention, he said calmly. Now, if you will excuse me. Lady Margaret had expected anger, disbelief, perhaps even a breaking of the engagement. She had not expected calm acceptance. It confused her, and that confusion made her more determined than ever. The Duke, however, was not fooled. He had seen through Lady Margaret's scheme from the beginning, and he knew that the letter was a forgery, a clumsy attempt to ruin Eulalia's reputation. He had his own investigators look into the matter, and they discovered the truth. Lady Margaret had paid a former servant to forge the letter, hoping to drive a wedge between him and Eulalia. The Duke was furious. He confronted Lady Margaret in her drawing room, his voice cold with anger. You sought to destroy the woman I love, he said, his eyes blazing. You forged a letter, you attempted to ruin her reputation, all because you could not bear to see me happy. Lady Margaret paled. I do not know what you are talking about. Do not lie to me. I have proof. I have witnesses. I have everything I need to destroy you. Lady Margaret's composure cracked. Please, Your Grace, I only wanted what was best for you. She is not suitable, she is not worthy of you. You are not the judge of what is suitable or worthy. I am. The Duke stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. If you ever attempt to harm Miss Lindale again, I will see you ruined. Do I make myself clear? Lady Margaret nodded, too terrified to speak. The wedding took place on a cold November morning, in the small parish church of St. Mary's. Eulalia wore a simple white gown that had belonged to her mother, and she carried a bouquet of winter roses, their fragrance filling the air. The Duke was waiting for her at the altar, his eyes bright with love. He had never looked more handsome, more sure of himself, more complete. You are beautiful, he whispered as she reached his side. The most beautiful woman I have ever seen. Eulalia smiled. You are biased, Your Grace. Perhaps. But I am also right. The ceremony was brief and heartfelt, and by the time it was over, Eulalia was the Duchess of Ravensworth. She had come a long way from the poor spinster who had dared to speak her mind at her father's dinner table. The years that followed were happy ones. The Duke was a devoted husband, and Eulalia was a loving wife. They had 2 children, a boy and a girl, and they raised them in the vast, imposing castle that had once seemed so cold and unwelcoming. The Duke had changed, too. He had become a better man, more open, more honest, more willing to show his emotions. And it was all because of Eulalia, the woman who had dared to tell him the truth. "I love you," he said one evening, as they stood on the balcony of the castle, watching the sun set over the valley. "I have loved you since the moment you told me I was rude." Eulalia laughed. "You have a strange way of showing it." "I have learned, my dear. I have learned to be honest, to be open, to be kind. And it is all because of you." She leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. "I love you too, Your Grace. More than I ever thought possible." They stood there, watching the sun sink below the horizon, and Eulalia knew that she had made the right choice. She had spoken her mind to a rude guest at dinner, and she had found the love of her life. The years passed, and Eulalia grew into her role as Duchess with grace and dignity. She oversaw the household, managed the staff, and became a beloved figure in the local community. She was known for her kindness, her generosity, and her unflinching honesty, a quality that had endeared her to the Duke from the very beginning. But the shadow of Lady Margaret's betrayal lingered. Eulalia had not forgotten the humiliation, the fear, the anger that she had felt when she discovered the truth. And she could not help but wonder if there were others out there, waiting to destroy her happiness. One evening, over dinner, she broached the subject with the Duke. "Your Grace, I have been thinking about Lady Margaret." The Duke's expression darkened. "I would rather not discuss her." "I know, but I have to. She tried to destroy me, and she almost succeeded. What if there are others who would do the same?" The Duke reached across the table and took her hand. "There will always be people who want to hurt us, my dear. But I will never let them. I love you, and I will protect you with my life." Eulalia smiled, her heart warm. "I know you will. And I will protect you, too." The Duke and Duchess of Ravensworth had a long and happy marriage. They traveled, they entertained, they built a life together that was filled with love and laughter. And when the Duke died, at the age of 75, Eulalia was by his side, holding his hand. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice weak. "For everything." Eulalia kissed his forehead. "I love you, Your Grace. I always have, and I always will." And then he was gone, leaving Eulalia to carry on without him. But she was not alone. She had her children, her grandchildren, and the legacy of a love that had endured for 50 years. She had spoken her mind to a rude guest at dinner, and she had found the love of her life. She had become a duchess, a mother, a grandmother. She had lived a life that was full and rich and meaningful. Eulalia Lindale was 25 when she told the Duke of Ravensworth that he was being discourteous at her father's dinner table. She was 25 when she changed the course of her life forever. And as she stood on the balcony of the castle, looking out at the valley that had been her home for 5 decades, she knew that she had made the right choice. She had spoken her mind, and she had found love. She had been brave, and she had been rewarded. She had lived a life that was worth living. And that, she knew, was the greatest victory of all. If Eulalia's story touched your heart, please hit that like button. It helps more romance lovers find our little community. Subscribe and turn on the bell so you never miss a new tale of unexpected love and second chances. Now, I have to ask, if you were sitting at that dinner table, would you have had the courage to speak the truth to the Duke? And which city are you watching from tonight? I read every single comment, and your words make these stories come alive. Share this story with someone who loves a good Regency romance. because the best tales are meant to be shared. Until next time, keep believing in love that's brave enough to speak the truth.